All right, so good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amna Ibrahim, research analyst at IIS. Today, we're going to be discussing the status of airborne attacks in the Middle East. And to start us off, just a little background on the issue. Airborne attacks are now a prominent feature of Middle Eastern competition and instability. Ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and UAVs are part of the arsenal of many states, and including many non-state actors as well. Attacks have ranged from combat use to strikes of strategic nature. Most notable of this is the now infamous 2019 attacks conducted via missiles and UAVs against Saudi Aramco facilities, but there are others worth examining today. The most recent attacks are the Houthi claimed strikes against the UAE and this week's attack against the Saudi airport in Jizan. Houthi capabilities have, in fact, excusing the pun, skyrocketed since the start of the Yemen war. In fact, IIS research has illustrated rapid advancement, with Houthis launching locally sourced Scud missiles in Saudi Arabia in 2015, to only 2 years later in 2017, launching a Borkin 2H at a staggering distance of 965 kilometers, far beyond any missile in Yemen's official arsenal. A UN panel of experts determined that the missiles was most likely part of Iran's Qiyam catalog and that had been cut into pieces, smuggled into Yemen, then reassembled. UAVs intercepted in 2016 in Marib were also found to resemble Iranian UAVs. Hezbollah has also come a long way, expanding their capabilities from rudimentary rockets and missiles in the 1990s to what is now an arsenal numbering in the tens of thousands, including thousands of long-range Fajr and Zilzal rockets. IRGC Brigadier General Salami stated that over 100,000 missiles were ready to be launched at any given moment in Lebanon. UAVs have also been deployed in Libya and Syria by states such as Turkey and the UAE, and extremist groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS have used small UAVs for urban and desert warfare. So why are missiles and UAVs becoming so prominent in regional warfare? What are their uses, risks, and benefits for the attackers? How can states defend against them? Is there a role for diplomacy and deterrence, or is the response mostly about managing the risk and defending? We have assembled today a panel of IIS specialists with expertise in proliferation, air power and missiles, and regional security. I will first go to Douglas Berry, our Senior Fellow for Aerospace, to share his insights about the technology aspects and the military uses of these capabilities, and ask him to discuss missile defense. I will then direct questions to William Alberg, the director of the IIS STAC program, and ask him to assess the missile and UAV challenge in the Middle East. And finally, I'll ask Emir Hikayem, the Senior Fellow for Middle East Security, to put these developments in their political and strategic context. So today's discussion will be on the record. The first 35 to 40 minutes will consist of a dialogue among the four of us. Then I will turn to the audience to take questions. You can raise your hand using the Zoom function. When I call on you, please introduce yourself briefly and ask a very succinct question. If you have a comment, you may do so under the condition that you respect the time constraints and that you keep it very brief. We will also be taking questions through the Q&A box. That might be a lot more convenient to some of you than asking your question live. Okay, so to start us off, Douglas, I'd like to start by asking you how the recent Houthi claimed attacks compare against previous airborne attacks carried out by other non-state actors in the region. Do they represent an escalation? Are they roughly on par with what we've already seen?
Thanks, Anna, and good day, everybody. In terms of how they compare, I suppose it depends on when you draw the timeline. But broadly speaking, what we've seen is growing capability and growing sophistication, if you like. To cast it in an overused phrase in a way, what we see is innovation and adaptation. I think that you mentioned the 2019 Aramco attack, obviously particularly significant in that we saw a mix of lethal UAVs, direct attack munitions, if you want to call them that, and a land attack cruise missile, the Quds-1, as it's known in the Houthi inventory. Pretty successfully used. It was certainly in, I would imagine, the Houthis' expectations, a very successful attack. And I think the attacks themselves, I think, are fundamentally about propaganda rather than military effect, partly just because of the comparatively small number of systems used, partly because of the sporadic nature. But what they show in terms of the Houthi narrative is the ability to strike back, is the ability to reach into either the KSA or the UAE and to retaliate against what they see as strikes against them. In terms of, are these escalatory? They're certainly escalatory in terms of capability. We've seen that mix of the ballistic threat, the lethal UAV, and the cruise missile increasingly used to stretch and test defensive capabilities. And I think that's one of the things that is a real takeaway from recent events, is that you pose an increasing challenge to the defender by mixing up ballistic threat systems, long-range, comparatively small, uninhabited systems, and cruise missiles. It presents the defender with a particularly wicked problem. Amna?
Yeah, so when it comes to the penetration that you talked about and their ability to kind of reach within these states, these kinds of capabilities, there's a lot of assumption and actually even evidence that Iran is somehow involved. What are the indications to suggest that Iran is involved in the attacks? Could the Houthis have carried out the attacks without the intelligence support from Iran? And if you can also tell us a bit about what's your assessment of Iran's UAV arsenal? How good are they?
I think if you look for indications of external involvement in terms of what the Houthi have been doing and are able to do, just the level of technology that we've seen, it seems to be beyond the domestic capability to produce. I think particularly for me in terms of cruise missiles, I mean, the Quds-1 and the Quds-2, which we think are known as the 351 within Iran. I mean, elegant is the wrong word, but it's a very neat system in a way, because the Iranians have had a long-standing goal of developing a land attack cruise missile. Goes back to probably the late 1990s, early 2000s. The initial programs, the names that first came out, it was known as Meshkat, and then we saw something called Sumar, and we saw something called Havesi. These all come off or are based on a Russian design, the Ka-55, so the RS-AS-15, a land attack cruise missile designed in the Soviet era. Quds is different. Quds is a much smaller system, notionally shorter range, and in some ways considerably less capable. It is, however, in service, and the kind of Sumar or Havesi is probably only just beginning to enter the Iranian inventory now. We've never seen, as far as I'm aware, the Quds actually in Iranian service, but I'd be very surprised if it wasn't, in part because of how successful it's been in the attacks that are attributed to the Houthi. Although, as I say, I think the weapon in this case, the Quds, is very clearly of an Iranian origin. In terms of the Iranian UAV inventory, I think one of the things we've always got to keep in mind with the Iranians is there's a lot of kind of deception, misinformation in the open source arena, which is what we rely on. You will see the same name attributed to multiple systems. You'll see a single design mock-up rolled out, a variety of claims made about it. But that's not to say in amongst all of these are credible systems that are in kind of comparatively widespread use within the Iranian armed forces. I think the Muhajir series of UAVs, of tactical UAVs, I think has been in service for a considerable time. There's a family that sits under that name. Similarly, Shahed. And then alongside that, we've seen them develop in recent years a range of small precision-guided, in inverted commas, weapons designed specifically for the UAV capability. And then beyond that, as I say, and I alluded to earlier, we've seen the emergence of a kind of subclass of UAV, if you like, the kind of lethal UAV or direct attack munition, which kind of sits somewhere between a UAV and a very, very low-cost cruise missile. That doesn't mean that as a defender you can ignore it. It just makes the picture you're faced with that more complicated, if you like. Anna?
So what about the capabilities for states? So for example, the US Navy Fifth Fleet have created their task force dedicated to UAVs, and they're including their regional partners in the Middle East, especially in the Gulf. They stated the reasons were monitoring of maritime trade routes. We've also seen in terms of air defense systems, so not just in terms of, their own UAV arsenals being built up as states, there's air defense systems. So the UAE was an early buyer of THAAD. How do they perform during these attacks? Are the Gulf states able to invest in these systems and actually protect or defend against airborne attacks?
I think in terms of the kind of overall ISR role of UAVs, I think it's difficult to overstate the potential value of UAVs in terms of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, which is in many ways where they were first introduced and were increasingly widely adopted. If you like, being forewarned is being forearmed. ISR has an obvious role in deterrence in this sense. I mean, the ability to have a kind of persistent overwatch on Iran's activities, I think, obviously has a clear benefit, both in terms of conventional deterrence and in terms of the ability to react if you need to. In terms of the defence picture, how do the region's countries stack up? Well, obviously the UAE used THAAD successfully in the recent attacks to defeat one or more incoming ballistic threats. Very noticeable that this was carried out. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has been using its Patriot batteries consistently. I think one of the challenges here, one of the interesting things that is taken into account, but we all need to consider, is obviously you have a limited arsenal depth with these things. So I would imagine that the kingdom has been burning through its Patriot rounds at a reasonable pace. So inventory depth is an issue, as is the cost per shot. Using a high-end, very capable missile against a comparatively simple threat, in simply monetary terms, you can kind of look at it and go, well, does it make a great deal of sense? But it does if the option is that rather than engage, you don't engage, and that threat actually hits a target and has an enormous propaganda value. More broadly, you kind of see this kind of need for yet greater integration amongst the GCC nations in terms of air and missile defence. I think it's probably making the region think more about layered defence as well in terms of dealing with air and missile threats. The capacity to take at long range a shot and be able to tell if you've been successful or not, and if you haven't, then take another shot. Which, the more opportunities you have to engage and defeat a system, the better, all the way out from basically, ideally, obviously before it's launched in the case of ballistic system, but there are obviously issues around that. And in terms of the air breathing threat, the UAVs and cruise missiles, again, the sooner you can engage at range, the better, but you want to give yourself options to engage all the way down from, long, medium, short to point defence. And I think it's quite possibly at the shorter end of the spectrum that we might see sort of, increased focus in terms of the GCC, because it's one of the areas where some of those systems are mature and probably need replacing. Amna?
Thank you, Douglas. I'm going to move on to William. I do want to ask you some questions about Iran's missile program as well, William. But at the beginning, can you give us, an update on the Vienna talks? Are we in the last stretch of the Vienna talks, really? Could you give us a sense of the progress? What are we expecting?
Sure. I mean, the noises coming out of Vienna certainly suggest that anticipation is high and that we're close to a decision point. The Russians have been particularly active. The lead negotiator there, Mikhail Ulyanov, has been really, really active on Twitter, highlighting the idea of a deal. So even the Chinese backing the Russians, seeming to put the US under some pressure. It looks like we're down to just the final political issues that EU and France have been making noise as well. But this is only the 10th month of negotiations and only the 8th round. We usually have 20 or more rounds. So we've oscillated in the talks between total despair, this thing is falling apart, and total euphoria that we're moments away. So betting is very difficult in these situations. But we are pretty sure, based on all the diplomatic leaks, and as we all know, Vienna leaks like a colander. There's a 20 or so page document on the table that lays out the phases of mutual steps to return to compliance with the agreement. And we'll see. There are reports that some of the Iranian money is stuck in South Korean banks. There have been talks between the South Koreans and Iranians just recently. So it would seem to confirm that we're on our way back to a deal. As to what the substance is, I think, the US has said it has to address Western prisoners, as to whether that's part of the written deal or just done by Iran as a goodwill gesture in coordination. But the US is going to insist that Western prisoners are released. Iran's going to have to suspend the enrichment at least above 5%, and then eventually come back down to the original JCPOA cap of 3.67. As you know, they've been enriching up to 60%. Highly enriched uranium. Once you pass, around 30% enrichment threshold, you can make nuclear weapon. Enriching up to 99% is not that much of a challenge. So this is a very, very big deal. And then, the US will probably continue to do waivers rather than some on Iranian oil sales like they did in the original deal, rather than permanent, lifting. So there's going to have to be a series of steps on immediate sanctions relief, on getting that money out of the South Korean banks, on oil sales, on prisoners, and then we move towards re-implementation day. That's what they're calling it now. The original was implementation day. Now it's re-implementation day. There's reportedly a bunch of X's for how many days all these steps are supposed to take until re-implementation day. And the Iranians are still demanding some kind of guarantee about the potential for future US withdrawal. This is a big sticking point. The US withdrawal from the agreement was a stinging blow to the Iranian negotiators who advocated for this deal within the system. And the US can't really offer any promises. There is word that Iran may be seeking an actual rate to enrich above the limit back up to 60%. If the US re-withdraws from the agreement. and the reason that's important is Iran has said that it should have the right to do this. The European and other parties to the agreement say that this is not allowed, so they would need some kind of agreement that would be allowed if the US withdraws. But the lifting of particularly sensitive sanctions is going to require face-to-face meetings between the US and the Iranians. That has not happened. All eyes now are on the US negotiator, Robert Malley, and the Iran chief negotiator, Ali Bagheri. I saw a report yesterday that said he might be going back to Tehran. And so this may be to consult with the Iranian Supreme National Council. They usually meet on Saturdays. So this weekend could be a really big deal. If he comes back with political cover to agree to a deal, then all eyes will be on where the ministers of foreign affairs are. They will likely have to sign off on whatever this 20-page re-implementation roadmap looks like. So, if you suddenly see a bunch of diplomatic planes flying to Vienna, then we might have a deal. But nothing is agreed till everything is agreed,
Definitely, yeah. And, really the question is, for Gulf states, and especially in the region, there was this push at the very beginning, prior to the talks, about having a broader scope. We saw that didn't happen. We kept a narrow scope. So what is the impact, if progress is made in the Vienna talks, on the actual Iranian missile program? Because that is what worries Gulf states. Can it be contained through negotiations as well? And if so, what would be the format of that? And what else other than missile defense, could attack states do in terms of balancing?
Right. So, not just for Gulf states, but for all states, I've talked to people about this. It always confused me what the point of the JCPOA was in the longer term. I'm an arms control purist. For me, arms control buys you time in an arms race lessens tension, lessens the chance of conflict in order to give you time to solve the underlying political issues. The Iran deal just appeared to kick the can down the road and hope that this would create miracles in Iran and they'd become sweet and loving and all the problems would be solved. That's not usually how Earth works, so I'm not sure why anyone ever thought that was rational. So here I align with, in your question, I align with the GCC states. Immediately upon finishing a deal, I would say back in 2015, we should have immediately started talks on regional security with the Iranians and on Iranian missile proliferation, both vertically in terms of their own capabilities and horizontally in terms of the spread of missiles, and on Iran's support for proxies and on other issues. We didn't do that. And so I'm not really sure why anyone's surprised that the Iran deal, didn't solve all the problems. You have to have missile talks with Iran. You have to. And I think the format for that, so I think that we should do top down and bottom up. On the one hand, there's a lot of regional dialogue bilaterally between states in formats that we've never seen before. We've seen the Israeli president visit the UAE. We've seen Saudi Arabia and Iran talk. There's all kinds of bilateral things going on, which I think are very positive. So I think you should, in the bilateral talks, raise missiles. I think we should look at convening a regional forum of countries to talk about missile proliferation. I think we should also have top down. I think there should be really high level engagement and discussion about creating a multilateral format to discuss talks and what would be on the table and how we would get at them. The US would have to engage directly bilaterally as well with Iran. There may be some capability for proxy talks, shuttle diplomacy between a state that Iran is willing to talk to and Israel. So I think if you have all of these things going on at the same time, you can bring, if the JCPOA is re-implemented, I think then you can begin a dialogue on missiles. I think there's a certain degree of exhaustion in terms of the conflict in Yemen. Maybe there's some deals to be had there with Iran and their support to the Houthis. And we can get at what's driving that, if you like, a little bit later. Then their support for Hezbollah is a much tougher nut to crack. But if we can start some dialogue on transparency, on doctrines, on maybe even some kinds of caps on missiles, like I said, bilaterally, regionally, bottom up and top down, you might be able to see some progress that again can get at some of the drivers of Iran's missile program and the drivers of missile proliferation in the region, rather than just sticking a band-aid on it, pretending it's done and moving on to the next crisis.
Neil, I want to bring you in on this conversation. To what extent do Middle Eastern states view the airborne attacks, that they do link to Iran as a threat? Do they view the acquisition of air defense capabilities as their #1 priority? And if you could add a little bit to what William was saying about the possibility of talks, are they going to just focus on defending themselves, or would they be open then to talks with Iran? And who would be?
Thank you, Amna. Good morning, good afternoon to all. To what extent do Middle Eastern states see those attacks as a threat? They do, very much so. I mean, if you're Saudi Arabia, you've had over 500 attacks since 2015 of all kinds, probably even more than that. We don't have, all the data. Not all the attacks are reported, and there's a lot happening on the southern border that with Yemen that we don't know. But we know enough to say that critical infrastructure is being attacked. I mean, Doug mentioned Saudi Aramco. Obviously, that came from Iran, but the Houthis themselves have attacked airports, civilian centers. There's evidence that they've went after military bases and so on. So if you're Saudi Arabia, you see yourself as exposed from the south and from the northeast. You also see a growing threat. We won't discuss that, but also at sea. But we're focusing on airborne attacks here. So this is really on top of the agenda for them. For the UAE as well, there is exposure. I mean, if those recent attacks really came from Yemen, then suddenly, you are in range. You're within range of Houthi attacks, and that, as Doug said, it was primarily political and psychological. It was a propaganda attack. But it does matter, that, a country that viewed and portrayed itself as secure and stable suddenly is shaken by something like that. Obviously, the UAE could be also threatened from the north. The other Gulf states are, less exposed, not because they're not vulnerable, but because they are lower on the list, and that the Houthis themselves don't have an interest. The Iranians don't have an interest in pushing them. There is perhaps, one example once of, I think, a UAV attacking a pipeline linking Saudi to Iran. I think that was in 2017 or so. But Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar haven't come under attack yet. But for them, they see this developing picture, and they wonder, will we be targeted one day? Do we have to do something about it? Do we need to start talking to the Americans or possibly other providers of systems? I mean, it's interesting that, for instance, the S-400, the Russian system, was discussed with the Qataris. It didn't go far, just like with Saudi Arabia, but it's just evidence that it is on people's mind. So I would say it is one of the top threats that Gulf countries look at, and especially because it's so hard to deal with it. Issue of deniability, of attribution, and so on. It just it's not that you have an attack and you have a clear, direct reaction to it, right? It's a lot more confusing for states how to navigate this one. You were also asking about, sorry, you asked me about what William said. I just forgot.
Right. Yeah. What states in the region would be willing to have talks with Iran? Because a lot of states have, at the end of the day, held Iran responsible, or have, believed in the kind of assumption that, Iran is behind these attacks. They will
look. I suspect a number of countries in the region will engage in the theatrics of diplomacy. They will sit down if there is a format and so on. But I don't think that they have high expectations that whatever they do will somehow affect positively the thinking in Iran. I think there is a sober understanding in the region that missiles like missiles and UAVs, like partner militias, like the nuclear program, are like central elements of Iranian security policy, and that the immediate neighbors are not the ones with the greatest influence on Iranian thinking. So for them, really the question is how much you invest in diplomacy versus how much you invest in defense, how much you invest in balancing the acquisition of their own capabilities if they wanted to. So this is an ongoing debate. It's really about that mix. It's not about completely trusting diplomacy to fix that. But they're unlikely to be the ones saying, you know what, we don't want the track altogether. I mean, if anything, I think their frustration, and going back to what William was saying, was that the 2015 nuclear deal didn't lead immediately to these other tracks, right? Which is why they started resenting the deal even more than they actually did. And in a way, that explains the support of Saudi and the UAE primarily for the Trump withdrawal from the deal. It was more about the frustration with the diplomacy around the deal, the 2015 deal, than the deal itself. And missiles is a key element of that. They also see, I mean, importantly, they see Iran having, I think ISS research shows that Iran has 20 types of ballistic missiles, and I think 3-4 types of UAVs, and I don't know how many cruise missiles. I mean, Doug would know all the details there. But they look at this inventory, and they're like, we're really behind. The Iranians have done a lot of this at home. They've developed talent, expertise. It's not just reliant on procurement anymore. It's really not something we can do much about. We need an international regime, or we need a US-driven effort in the region to do that. It may not happen altogether, but I still think it's still a realistic assessment of their own influence that the Gulf states have.
Can you tell us more about Iranian-backed groups? You mentioned about Iran having all of these different capabilities and diversity in the capabilities. There seems to also be some type of diversity between the non-state actors that are backed by Iran in terms of Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah. What is the difference in their use of rockets, missiles, and UAVs?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's not just Iranian-supported groups that have those capabilities. We've seen extremist groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS use, UAVs and other capabilities. But the ones that have benefited from state sponsorship have the most advanced and diverse and technologically deployable arsenals, right? So, you mentioned 3 of them: Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. And I think it's very interesting to compare them because it tells us something about Iran's thinking as well, right? I would argue, the Houthis have had access to the longer range missiles so far, and from what we see, because they use them, so therefore we can study what's there. But they've gone deep into Saudi territory, that reached the UAE. So Iran has helped. I mean, early on, to be honest, the Houthis used locally sourced Scuds, but over time, they started deploying Iranian provided technology. And for the Houthis, the use of those missiles has been to harass the Saudis, remind them that they're not achieving their goals, that the Houthis are still standing, that every time they get hit at home, they can retaliate and embarrass and so on. And so it's really for psychological and political effect. In the case, I think, of Hezbollah, the perspective is a bit different. The idea, first and foremost, is about deterrence. It's about putting the Israelis on their toes at all times. So you have this very large arsenal. Obviously, Israeli urban and industrial and military centers are much closer to the Lebanese border than the Houthis are to the Saudi hinterland. So they don't necessarily need the same range, but they need mass. And when you need mass to overwhelm systems, it means that you don't necessarily need the fanciest of missiles and of rockets. You just need them to be good enough. And that would be mostly useful to avert a conflict. So you deter Israel, you remind Israel that if you were to do something, the cost will be very high. But also very importantly, in case there is a conflict, it wouldn't be, I mean, the Yemen, this phase of the Yemen war, not talking about the Houthi takeover in 2014, but from the Saudi-led intervention, it's from 2015 till today, right? Where it's like 6-7 years. In the case of Hezbollah and Israel, the thinking is very different. The expectation will be that these will be very short and very intense wars. So that what matters here is the tempo. It's sending volley of rockets and missiles after volley and to make the point, you can take us down. How many rockets or how many missiles a day you fire is very important for Hezbollah. It's very important for Iran. This is how you affect the Israeli psyche. This is you show Israel that you cannot win that one, and so on. So the thinking here is different. They don't necessarily need the range. They need the mass, and they need greater accuracy to hit and hinder Israeli military preparedness in the rear, right? That's very important.
So it's about overwhelming kind of the system.
It is about trying to overwhelm the systems. I mean, the Israelis have sophisticated missile defense systems. So the best way to deal with that is to throw as much as you can and overwhelm that.
Douglas, sorry, Emil, go ahead.
I just wanted to say Hamas is different in comparison. I mean, first, Hamas is more constrained because it doesn't have the same supply line, access to the supply lines and so on. It doesn't necessarily have the same talent, the same technology, the same history in that. So the use of rockets that we saw for Hamas it was in June, I think, yeah, is different. It's also primarily psychological and so on. It's to just force the Israeli leadership to come to terms that they cannot completely defeat and so on. It's a bit similar to Hezbollah in terms of Iran's thinking, but Iran is not fully invested in that. It's not trying to turn Hamas into another Hezbollah because there is a million limitations to that, including Hamas's own preferences. So it is telling, comparing those three groups, it tells us something about what Iran really seeks from each of them.
Douglas, in terms of the technology that we're talking about with Houthis, Hamas, and Hezbollah, Emil mentioned this, but did you want to add any remarks about that? What differences do you see in terms of these groups' technologies and their systems?
I suppose really the thing that strikes me most is that the Houthi cruise missile capability. The others we've seen anti-ship systems, but it's really so far, thankfully, arguably, the land attack cruise missile capability, certainly in use, has been limited to the Houthi.
And I'm going to move on to open up questions. So if attendees want to start raising their hands, you're free to do so, or put in your questions in the Q&A. But right before I go to that, I want to discuss the U.S. and the U.S.'s role in response. We haven't really addressed that yet. So I'm going to first point the question to Emil. What is the U.S. response to the Houthis' claimed attacks on the UAE, for example? We should probably kind of focus on that. And how does it differ to the 2019 Saudi Aramco attacks in Abqaiq? Is there a difference, and why?
Well, I mean, there is a difference. In the case of the 2019 attacks, the Trump administration didn't want to point the finger at Iran early on. The Biden administration was much faster in identifying and condemning the attacks. The 2019 attacks came from Iran, whereas these attacks probably came from the Houthis themselves. So it's easier. If the attacks had come from Iran, I don't know what the Biden administration would have done. I can speculate, but I certainly don't know. So we see a difference. It's easier for the US and for France, by the way, which came out with a very strong statement of support for the UAE, to do that against an armed non-state actor than another country with which you have complex security discussions on the nuclear proliferation front and so on. And I suspect that was an element of Iran's thinking. I mean, you know, from my end, without evidence, but I still suspect that the Iranians had at least knowledge of the incoming Houthi attack against the UAE. You know, I can't talk about consent or direction or whatever, but you know, but the point is that, you know, it's telling that it's not the Iranians who did it, that it's the Houthis, and okay, we can discuss why. But the point here is, it was easier for the US to make a political statement. It was easier for CENTCOM to, you know, just be present. It was easier for the French to say that they're going to do something. I'm not a defense expert, so, you know, I don't know exactly what materially they're doing, but it wasn't lost. The UAE is a critical partner of these two countries, France and the US, and they've had good relations. The UAE is trying to acquire, well, we don't know yet, but the F-35. They just bought the French Rafale. So they expect those Western partners to be there, to make the statements, to you know, show muscle if and where they can. Different from 2019. I mean, the 2019 Abqaiq and Khurais attacks are, I would argue, a turning point in Gulf security because of how they expose Saudi vulnerabilities, but also exposed US calculations and limitations. You know, this was the kind of attack that, you know, 10 years ago, we would have expected would have led to some real retaliation, direct retaliation against Iran, and that hasn't happened.
William, I'd like to go to you about this as well. Do you feel like there was a difference in the US response when it comes to the Houthi attacks on the UAE versus the Houthi attacks in 2019? And in terms of also the Western partners as well, and why? You know, Emil, you know, is saying we expected more, but what does that mean? Can you shed light on that?
Well, no, I mean, I agree with Emil entirely in his remarks. The response is different because, for lack of a better word, we're almost getting used to this now. So when CENTCOM General McKenzie said, we're going to deploy F-22s to the region, not really sure what an F-22 does against a drone, but maybe that's more signaling against Iran. The USS Cole has been deployed to the UAE waters, and they're going to improve anti-UAV capabilities in the region. So you know, so yeah, that's been different. But also the UAE has done some really important things in terms of its own response to these types of attacks. So the UAE has developed much better missile defenses. Really, its ability to intercept ballistic missiles is fantastic. They've got the Patriot PAC-3s. They have ordered the THAAD. As my IIS colleague John Krasniak said in the press, it's really cruise missiles and UAVs that are a bigger threat because they can evade radar and defenses, but UAE is purchasing the Russian Pantsir S-1M to provide mobile defense against cruise and UAVs and loitering munitions. But secondly, UAE is improving resilience. So their ability to harden their facilities and to quickly repair and restore the oil supply, that's a big deal because, you know, Saudi Arabia's oil supplies were interrupted for quite some time in the 2019 attack, but UAE's ability now to get the ADNOC facility back underway almost immediately takes away some of the utility of these attacks. And then obviously the coalition retaliation has been swift and severe. I mean, there's real deadly airstrikes in Yemen in January. Increased regional cooperation and coordination against the Houthis, and, like, you know, the visit of the Israeli president to UAE for the first time in history. This really shows to Iran that a regional response could further isolate them and further create a nightmare for Iran and for the Houthis, where a real robust international consensus against the Houthis, against Iran, and actual defense collaboration in order to coordinate missile defenses and to better handle these threats could be underway.
So I am going to ask some questions from the audience. We have an anonymous attendee asking, is it likely we will see greater Israeli GCC cooperation with states who have signed the AA in air and missile defense in the future, given both face similar threats and Israel has proven layered defensive architecture? William, and if Douglas can speak to any of the technicalities involved in these air and missile defenses and their procurement as well. Thank you. William, can you go ahead first?
Yeah, I'll defer to Douglas on the technicalities, but yes, as I was mentioning in my earlier response to your question on the Iran nuclear deal, we are seeing, and I just mentioned, we are seeing more bilateral contacts. We're seeing more coordination. We're seeing more cooperation. As to whether we're going to see real more direct defense coordination, that's a fantastic question. And again, I think in a way, Iran's proliferation of missiles to the Houthis has actually weakened their security considerably. If you see greater coordination, if you see greater cooperation, and if you see real regional coordination, I mean, my gosh, if you see actual coordination of air and missile defense with Israel and countries, it's like in the East, if you saw Japan and South Korea really coordinate in defenses and really stand up together with the United States on missile defenses, that would be a game changer in that region. Similarly, if the bridge between Israel and these countries is really being crossed with the Abraham Accords and other bilateral talks, then that can really reshape Iran's security calculus. And I think that would be a good thing. So
do you feel like it would be likely to actually see that?
I think the more crazy stuff you see, the more proliferation you see to non-state actors, the more threats you see, the more Iran attempts to use warfare by other means to attack with impunity. I think the more countries say, okay, how do we change Iran's calculus? Clearly, building defense capabilities is important. To have deterrence, to have strike capability to hit Iran is important, and to hit these proxies and really, really damage them is important. But ultimately, you have to look at what else would hurt Iran the most. And as Iran continues to lower the cost of those kinds of political interactions by really threatening their interest, eventually, that cost benefit point meets, and they say, well, we might as well go ahead and do the thing that changes Iran's security calculation the most.
Douglas, do you want to add in some remarks about what does Israel bring to the table on this?
Yeah, just to follow up on William's comments. There's a clear logic to this, but there's also a but. And I think that goes in part, it speaks to the GCC nations themselves could do more to fully integrate their own capabilities, that they're not there yet. And sharing what gets called a recognized air picture, so your radar threat picture, it's a big move. It's even amongst the GCC states, as far as I'm aware, that isn't fully done yet. Is there a logic to improving your kind of the regional capabilities with Israeli involvement? Yes, but I don't think they're there yet. I think there's probably some distance to go. Simply because of the politics of the region. In terms of looking at what the Israelis are capable of doing, I think if you look at the layered approach as the question alludes to, it's a very credible capability, and at the very least that's something that the GCC can look to just in terms of a template to say, okay, what else do we need to do?
Emil, we have a question that goes straight to this point of, the GCC investing in their capabilities. Are GCC procurements of highly capable and expensive air and missile defenses an appropriate solution to defending against relatively crude and low-cost airborne attacks from non-state actors? Are there more cost-effective left or right of launch measures GCC states could pursue in parallel to minimize this risk? And this question was submitted by Timothy Wright.
Thanks. So complex question, so complex answer. First, those attacks, as Doug and William said, are meant first and foremost to achieve psychological effect. So you need to figure out how you talk to your population, how, and in the case of the GCC states, a population where you have nationals as well as expats, and how you describe the threat, how you honestly level with concerns and so on. But you have to do so while maintaining the prestige of the state and maintaining the security guarantee that you've given to the population. So you have to figure out how much you invest in civil defense, which is making people aware of what the issue is and what are the risks attached to it and what they can do about it. Then you have to move to defense, air defense, which Doug and William talked about, and how much of that you own, how much of that you do multilaterally with other GCC states, so there are political issues involved, and how much you rely on Western countries, especially the US. Then you have to talk about what you're doing from a preemptive or retaliatory aspect. So if you're attacked, do you retaliate? And is that the right way of proceeding? I mean, who do you retaliate against? Do you have the intelligence and the confidence that you're going after the right people? Because you can retaliate against the Houthis, and that has happened, but you can't retaliate against Iran because that would lead to an escalation. So how do you create the right expectations from that sense? And then there's the question of, do you arm yourself? Do you seek balancing? Do you equip yourself with missiles, with armed UAVs? Well, they're already starting to do that. But do you do that to balance? Do you do that to deter? I mean, it's a complicated game. So I think all in all, the Gulf states in particular have, a quite difficult mix of challenges to explore. Some of them are resourceful. They have the money. They starting to build the armed forces and so on to do that. But do they have the right concept, and are they willing to make some of the hard political choices? I mean, as Doug and our wonderful late colleague Mike Elliman and others have done in the past, looking at missile defense cooperation in the Middle East. The hard part is the politics. And you need to fix that part if you want your external providers to be fully on board. If they feel that there's something that you can do but you're not doing because of politics, they'll be a bit more frustrated, right? They will be there, they will think, but they will tell you that the best system is if you work together. And that's one of the hard issues to resolve.
We only have a few more minutes. I want to move on to a question by Wolfgang Mulberger. So he says, thanks for the excellent contributions. One, what about UAV capabilities of the PMU in Iraq? So we really haven't, discussed Iraq at all. For instance, the recent attack on the PM's residence was attacked by such means. And his sub-question is, beyond the technicalities of military capacity, what about efforts to find a negotiated solution to the conflict in Yemen beyond the specific aspect of the Houthis, which are only one element of a bigger puzzle? And William and Emil both have, spoken a lot about efforts to have negotiations and the likelihood of that. But does anyone want to address the Iraq factor? Douglas, maybe, or Emil?
I can take a shot at that. I mean, just because it's another of the militias that we studied. I mean, in a way, the Iraqi militias are the least well equipped compared to the Hamas. I mean, which is not particularly well equipped, but Hezbollah and the Houthis, and that's also because of what they need in terms of war fighting equipment. They're not an expeditionary force. Well, they have gone to Syria and so on, but my point is that they don't play the same role as the Houthis and Hezbollah because of political realities within Iraq, and also because they're able to get what they need from existing stocks in Iraq. So it's not that Iran prioritized the provision of missiles and UAVs to them. And you know, the indications about the attack against the Prime Minister, Mustafa al-Kazemi, was that this was a pretty crude device. It wasn't something particularly sophisticated. It was probably sent, you know, within a couple of kilometers from the residence and so on. So we're not talking about the same range. We're not talking about the same sophistication. And that's just, I think that's because, as I said earlier, Iran looks at these groups very differently. Specific groups have specific needs, and therefore they require specific resourcing. And yeah, that's all I have to say.
And not to push back too hard on you, Emil, but you know, the 2019 Abqaiq attacks, there was all of this controversy over whether those attacks actually came in from Iraq or whether they did come in from the Houthis. Do you have any comments on that?
I mean, you know, Doug will know more than me about that, but I think it's pretty clear that they came from Iran. They may have come from the north, traversed some Iraqi airspace, possibly Kuwaiti airspace, and the thing. So figuring out, I mean, looking at the angle of attack and so on, it's not very difficult. And you know, the Saudi government, I mean, it took the Saudi government a few days, but they said it, that it came from Iran. It was the US that wasn't necessarily willing, I mean, at least Donald Trump tweeting, wasn't willing to assert that because he felt that that would commit him to a response, and he wasn't willing to do so.
Douglas, do you want to add any remarks on these issues?
Yeah, just very briefly, to kind of support what Emil said, and maybe to put it in a slightly more broader, more general context. I think one of the things that is interesting here is that you kind of see a pattern emerging of imitation, if you like, and it isn't just in the context of Iraq. I would imagine that kind of non-state actors in a variety of locations have been looking at what the Houthi have been doing, what they've achieved, what they've had access to, and kind of thought, I'd quite like some of that too. I mean, my own personal concern is you kind of the kind of very low cost kind of cruise missile lookalike capabilities that we see. And to the point on the attack itself, again, this is you know, we use the term UAV, it covers a very, very broad range of platforms. And one of the difficulties you have is at the kind of very bottom end of the technology scale, there's a kind of corner shop / Radio Shack style system. But that doesn't mean it can't be lethal, and it doesn't mean that it can have a huge effect. So how you kind of manage all of this, I think, it's not an intractable problem, but it's a wicked problem.
Also, Douglas, we have a question from Neil Watts from CSI and King's College. Given the trend of battlefield assembly of drones, can the MTCR play a role in restricting components for drones? And also, I'd like to pose this question as well to William.
Yeah, if I start, and William will then offer the sensible conclusion. MTCR already covers certain classes of uninhabited systems. When MTCR was drafted, the UAV was a very, very different creature, and it's kind of reflected in the way that it hasn't, the regime has struggled to actually really get its head around how you manage the kind of emerging and continuous threat of uninhabited systems. Because there's obviously a very legitimate trade in these systems. At the same time, you've got to go, okay, well, how do we try and align all of the MTCR signatories' interests? And that's proved difficult. We've seen that in the case of the US. Is the MTCR necessarily the right tool for a whole range of the kind of other kinds of UAVs that we see out there? I think it's pretty difficult in a way. And again, it goes back to the kind of corner shop, Radio Shack hobbyist style technology. I mean, that in some ways is as difficult to manage, in part, perhaps, if not actually more so. William?
I mean, you've hit it. Yeah, as you pointed out, the problem of battlefield stuff is at the lethality at the very low end, and the ubiquity of this technology and the dual capability of all that stuff makes it so difficult to limit. You can only really limit the very, very high end stuff that is very dedicated to it, which is why the stuff on the list is there. But yeah, no, I think you've answered that completely.
Thank you, first and foremost, to our speakers for your amazing contributions today. And really, this is an issue that we needed, you all to come and explain to everyone. And thank you to all the attendees for your patience and for your questions. And we are going to end it here. And yep, have a good evening, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, wherever you are.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.